You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and the former government special advisor Anita Boateng. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, according to The Times, Boris Johnson plans to recruit ministerial colleagues who may have fallen out of the number 10 inner circle, but who he sees as allies to defend him as questions over his leadership continue. The Guardian reports that the Prime Minister is being encouraged to hand over all evidence in relation to parties at Downing Street during lockdown, as opposed to considering the matter closed after the release of Sue Gray's report. The Eye understands NHS bosses are considering reversing course on making COVID vaccines compulsory for their staff, amid fears 70,000 of them could quit. The Express has word of what it calls a wonder pill, which purports to treat both COVID and the flu. The Mail pleads with the government to scrap a planned national insurance hike in an attempt to tackle the increasing cost of living. According to The Telegraph, the Attorney-General, Suella Braverman, is to seek an injunction to prevent the BBC reporting the identity of an alleged spy. The Financial Times hears that Netflix has lost $48 billion of its market value in a single day after projections showed its growth in subscribers slowing down. And The Mirror pays tribute to the singer Meat Loaf, who the paper says died of COVID. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Susan Boniface. Susan, I'm not sure that she is a Susan. Susie Boniface and Anita Boateng. Are you a Susan?
Don't ask. No one ever calls me that. I'm a Susie, and my mother will insist it on her deathbed.
Welcome to you both, Susie and Anita. Let's start with the Times. And this story about the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, surrounding himself with allies that really he feels supported by. So sort of surrounding himself with a massive comfort blanket. Is that going to help, Anita?
Well, I think it's very clear that the Prime Minister should and is circling the wagons on this. It's incredibly important that there is a shift, a monumental shift in the operation following what many perceive to be some own goals from number 10 in the past couple of weeks and months. And so this story reports that Boris Johnson is attempting to persuade, for instance, Eddie Lister, a former chief of staff, to come back into the operation, Linton Crosby, the so-called wonderkind who delivered Conservative majorities for David Cameron and for Boris Johnson. So, and Dan Rosenfeld, the current chief of staff, possibly saying that he might need to fall on his sword. So it definitely is one of those classic behind-the-scenes Westminster stories that speculates that Johnson is going to materially and significantly shake up his team.
And Susie, is this what his problem has been? He's not been surrounded by the right people. His attempts to do that now, is that going to make any difference?
Well, the most interesting bit of this story to me is in the second column, where Steve Swinton reports that Martin Reynolds, who is the sort of the assistant, the aide, I can't remember the exact job title now, private secretary, I think. That's right, private secretary, who actually organised the BYOB party on an email that's been sort of the biggest scandal out of the whole of the many parties. There's revelation here that he's actually flipped in terminology used by the FBI when dealing with the mafia. And he started talking candidly, in quotes, to Sue Gray. And this may well have been influenced, one might think, by briefings all last week saying that Martin Reynolds was going to get the bullet. So he's talking quite happily and he's telling her everything. Now, that does seem, according to this article, to have changed the attitude a bit within number 10. They do think now, according to the very first paragraph here, that a vote of no confidence is more likely than not, that when Sue Gray's report come out, there is going to be enough letters and that there will be a vote. And that's what Boris Johnson is circling the wagons for in order to try to win, because that will require a vote of 181 MPs. And so he's hoping to try and get that number behind him to win that eventual vote. And how he's doing that is he's using Grant Shapps, because during his leadership bid, Grant Shapps had a spreadsheet. I've got a spreadsheet, it's full of parties at the moment, but Grant Shapps had a spreadsheet during the leadership campaign in 2019 in which he listed all the MPs and where they were and whether they're supporting Boris or not. So he's brought Grant and his spreadsheet, his Excel, back in. Now, unfortunately, now he is Prime Minister, Boris Johnson's already got a whips operation that are doing exactly that kind of thing. So now he's got a whips operation, which as we all know is dysfunctional, and Grant Shapps and his spreadsheet, and they're both trying to do the same thing at the same time, while Boris Johnson is desperately trying to cycle backwards into where he was in 2019. Meanwhile, he seems to have been quite seriously weakened, because other papers are reporting, that he's giving away on this and the other, and he's going to do policies here and agree to what various backbenchers want. And Linton Crosby, the wunderkind Anita was talking about there, who helped Boris Johnson get elected back in 2019, has been asked to rejoin them, but isn't sure if he should, because he doesn't know if he can trust Boris Johnson's word when Boris says he will submit to what they call general election discipline, which is actually being told what to do for about 6 weeks.
And one wonders what he would be advised to do now. Let's move into The Guardian, Anita, and this story about having to provide more evidence surrounding the parties, irrespective of Sue Gray's investigation, which we hope to hear from next week.
Yes, and this is, I think, quite obviously for those of us who watch Westminster quite closely, Labour and the Liberal Democrats rightly trying to get into the story somewhat. So they are the ones that are kind of leaping on paper speculation that perhaps the report will not be a kind of who did it, who done it, naming all sorts of names, and there will be some kind of summary that will be provided for the public to consume. And they're therefore trying to do the running by arguing that the report needs to be published in full. It looks like a little premature because we don't actually know what's going to be in the report. And I would say in general that I'm not sure Number 10 is being helped by the endless briefings that we've just been talking about who's given what advice and what might be coming in the report, because ultimately none of us will really know until it's set out in black and white in that report.
It does sort of point to the fact that they're quite divided, the Tories, though, doesn't it, Anita?
I mean, certainly, it's definitely the most difficult moment in the Prime Minister's premiership so far, and a moment of maximum danger. Like, be in no doubt that the fact that there is such considerable speculation about a leadership challenge, almost regardless of what happens as a result of that challenge, is incredibly damaging to the Prime Minister.
Susie, do you think it's premature to call for more evidence surrounding the parties, regardless of Sue Gray's findings to come?
Oh, I agree it's premature, but I would also say it's politically very savvy, because what's going to happen next week is whenever Sue Gray's report comes out, and she's just a civil servant examining the interpretation of the guidance around the regulations. She's not examining whether the actual rules, the regulations were broken. She's looking at the guidance around it and how the people around the Prime Minister interpreted them. So it's very vague to start with. But whenever that report comes out and whatever it says, there are going to be lots of demands on all sides for the full background to be published. And so the fact that they're not intending to do that now, and we are definitely going to get those calls next week, means calling for it now, getting in there early, means that next week, Labour can say, we've been demanding this, Lib Dems can say, we've been demanding this for ages, you need to do it. And then they can later, when Boris Johnson perhaps has to give in either to the requests of his own backbenchers or the 1922 committee, or himself wants to publish that report because he believes it exonerates him in some way, he then looks like he's giving in to the opposition. So it's a very savvy move politically.
To the eye, which is quite a big story, I think, the massive U-turn that the government is taking on mandating up to 70,000 NHS workers to be vaccinated. They are pulling right back from that within 2 weeks of the deadline that they'd set. Anita?
Definitely. This is a huge, huge story. And I think, in part, it's been very clear that Sajid Javid, this Conservative government, did not want to introduce mandatory vaccinations for NHS staff. And I think it was a finely balanced decision on the basis of risk to those vulnerable people that need NHS treatment, who obviously want to be treated by people who are vaccinated, as a result of the fact that obviously unvaccinated people spread the disease much, much more easily, but also this concern about what it would do to retention. And so the story splashes on fears over a potential loss of 70,000 NHS workers, which is an enormous number at a moment where pressure on the NHS is only increasing. And so I feel it's a very finely balanced thing. Part of the decision around mandatory vaccinations was obviously to encourage and really kind of push people who work for the NHS into vaccinations. That seems to have worked somewhat, but whether it's going to be enough for the government to decide to actually row back on this idea that's supposed to be coming in April of mandatory sackings, essentially, if you're not mandatorily vaccinated, is quite a big step.
They just couldn't afford to lose 70,000 NHS workers, could they, Susie?
No, of course they couldn't. What's not clear here is whether that is still the figure that we're looking at. There was some talk about maybe 100,000 or 70,000 staff a few months ago when the policy sort of first came in. And we do know that in other countries where they introduced mandates like this for public servants, for New York police, for example, there were lots of talk about this is going to make thousands of people leave their jobs. And actually, it was a dozen or so, and it wasn't as bad. We don't know at the moment how many of these 70,000 are frontline medics, and they are the ones that would be most required to get that vaccine. There's plenty of other people, of course, who work in the NHS, and the vast majority of NHS staff, who consist of millions, have quite happily been vaccinated and are happy to be boosted and everything else. So this is a minority of NHS staff. We don't know how many of them are actually going to be affected in the long run. But like Anita says, the fact that the government is prepared to say, well, we're going to have to delay it a bit more because not enough are vaccinated yet is quite a U-turn. It's not quite a full donut, because they're not saying we're not going to bring in the vaccine mandate. They're just saying we're going to delay it a bit because of the staff shortages that we've had over the Omicron wave, to make it easier for the NHS to deal with when it does come in.
OK, Susie and Anita for the moment. Thank you. We are going to take a break, but coming up, more pressure on Boris Johnson to scrap a hike in taxes. More on that next. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Susie Boniface and Anita Boateng. Let's take a look at the Daily Mail front page and the story on the rise in national insurance contributions. Much disagreement with this hike that's being proposed, because it's going to add to all the woes that the public are experiencing with the cost of living rises. Susie, take us into this one.
Yeah, so this is one of those things where you've got a prime minister who's in a weakened position, and there are people in his party who are unhappy with this policy to start with, increasing national insurance contributions. Now events have happened, and we've got a cost of living crisis, we've got a fuel cap coming in April, as you said, and this is now looking increasingly unaffordable. The problem is Boris Johnson really needs the good headlines from papers like the Mail and the support from his backbenchers that getting rid of this increase would give him. He really needs it. Unfortunately, he's promised billions of pounds to the NHS. They're banking on it and they've planned for it. So if you're suddenly not going to have this tax hike, what do you do with the NHS? And the NHS, after the winter it's just had, really, really needs the cash. This is a sign of a weakened prime minister being put on the back foot by his party, saying, we want things. We want not just the red meat you want to give us. We want what we need. And you need to start complying with our requests. Otherwise, we're going to take you out. We're going to see more of this in the weeks to come, depending on what Sue Gray's report says, of course, and how things go from there. But there's going to be increasing signs of Boris Johnson having to give in to various different bits of his party. And
Anita, remind us of the Chancellor's line on this.
Well, the Chancellor's always been clear that what he wants to do is cut taxes. But I think the massive challenge that was presented by the NHS backlog meant that essentially this tax hike is going to deliver £36 billion into the NHS and eventually into social care. And it felt as though the Chancellor, certainly back in September when this was announced, felt as though he was in between a rock and a hard place, which was that the NHS did have a kind of voracious appetite for more funding, but ultimately he felt like if we took the pain now and increased taxes now, that would eventually lead to bringing down the backlog and then being able to cut taxes in the next few years. That was the strategy. I think that inflation, which is not the fault of this government, which is happening globally, is going to make things an awful lot tougher before they get better.
Right, we've just got about a minute to finish off on Adele and her disappointing her legions of fans who've spent enormous amounts of money to get out to see her in Las Vegas, but it's not going to happen, Susie.
No, she's left it till 24 hours before she opens her Las Vegas residency. It's in most of the papers today. I think it's the Times there. But on the Daily Mail, they've got 2 solid pages about a woman who's worth £150 million crying because she can't make 500 grand a night as of tomorrow. And the fact that she's
to be fair, she was crying because she was going to let her fans down. No?
Nah, don't believe it. 2 pages about the fans, fine. 2 pages about the millionaires crying.
You cynic, you cynic. We've run out of time, but thank you both for the moment.